IT Pro TV, an easy, entertaining approach to online IT training. Access over 2,000 hours of up-to-date, high-quality video content live and on demand via Chromecast, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, PC, or your mobile device. IT Pro TV's premium membership grants access to all courses, transcripts, virtual machine labs, and transcender practice exams. Corporate and group pricing are available. For a free 7-day trial and 30% off the life of your account, visit itpro.tv/securityweekly and use the code SW30. Has your network been breached? Cybereason can help you answer this question. Cybereason products hunt for threats within your network and eliminate them in real time. To Cybereason, real time means within seconds. Founded by former military hackers who don't play by the rules, they've built this experience into their platform. Harness ingenuity and imagination, not just code, to defeat hackers. Cybereason. Disrupt the adversary and let the hunt begin. NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email contact@netsparker.com. Onapsis, the leading provider of solutions to protect ERP systems from cyber attacks. Customers can secure their SAP and Oracle Business Critical platforms from espionage, sabotage, and financial fraud risks. Visit them on the web at onapsis.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to All Security Weekly. This is our security news for this week. Where do we begin, gentlemen? Lots of stories here.
That's a loaded question, Paul.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
I guess every security news source was writing an article about how President Trump is tweeting from a hackable Android device and the said implications.
Well, isn't that sort of an oxymoron? Android hackable. I mean, we know this, right?
We do.
So, okay, given that,
isn't every device hackable though?
Some are better than others. Okay. But actually, no, it's interesting.
No,
short answer, yes.
No, yes, but everything is hackable. So I think that the sensational media using the word hackable as being sensational about it, I think what they really mean is that Trump is tweeting from an uncontrolled device, right? Because some agency provides the president with a BlackBerry phone, from what I understand, for official business, that is tightly controlled. President Trump also has a personal device which theoretically is not tightly controlled in any manner, and that's really the issue.
Well, yeah, when he was sworn in, he took over the official @POTUS account, but and apparently that's what's on his BlackBerry. Or nothing's available on his BlackBerry. I don't know if I heard definitively.
Yeah. I don't.
But his original real Donald Trump account definitely is not available on the BlackBerry. So he's still using essentially a personal device to get access to it.
Yeah, we all know that. Certainly on the Android side, publish one application that looks sexy. I don't know, Compass or Weather app. And you can have command and control on the Android very quickly. Hackable, controllable, certainly. That's
and as Bruce, I think controllable from a defensive perspective. But if you lose control of that device, it can have disastrous consequences. And what Bruce Schneier was pointing out was the Android devices have a microphone, and that would be really bad. That if it was compromised, I think access to the Twitter account is just what people point to. I think access to the Google Play Store or any other applications installed is probably the most concerning thing that I would have on the phone. Not so much access to Twitter to make posts is one thing. Clicking on stuff inside of Twitter is probably a different risk level, obviously. But I think in either case, it can be dangerous, right? Especially, and the reason I say that is when we talk about attacks here on this show, we tend to classify them as like, Yeah, that's like a really cool attack, but you'd have to have like a really juicy target, like say, the President of the United States, to really want to be able to pull that off, or have enough resources and desire and need to pull that off. Whereas a lot of the attacks we've talked about, so even specifically for Android platforms, Joff, are largely theoretical. There may even be one in the story here this week, and one that I covered was like, if you can take a a video of someone entering their swipe code, their unlock code via the swipe.
Yeah.
You can get within 5 attempts of a successful swipe code on the device. Right. And now when I cover that story, I was like, I'm like, if you're living in a spy movie, you might want to take advantage of that. Might want to pay attention to that. But if you're the President of the United States, you're a huge target. And that's where I think much of the media kind of missed.
No, you're a huge target.
Huge target, like China.
So you're a huge target, and we don't know what his personal behavior is with regard to the Google Play Store. He could be speculatively installing every app that commands his attention, and indulging in what I would call unsafe smartphone behavior, especially in the Android space, and this is extremely concerning. And we
don't know all that.
About the apps, right?
But if you're, I would imagine that there is a team, at least a person, as the presidents have, right? Like there's a presidential photographer, right, whose job is to take pictures of the president. I'd imagine that there is a team of people in charge of the president's OPSEC. And if you're one of those people, you're like, look, Donald, you got to put that phone in this case when you are having these meetings or whatever, right? There very likely could be, if I was that person, I'd be like, look, you got to take that Android phone, and like when you're using it, you're not having meetings with anyone, you're not talking about anything. It's in this lead encased device or whatever it is, RF shielding,
RF cage,
an RF cage that you're putting that thing in, in basically in terms of national security, and hopefully that's the case, that there are procedures like that when this type of thing arises.
We absolutely, and I would concur. I absolutely hope that those procedures are in place. I think I'm probably being optimistic in saying so, but let's hope that that's the case.
I think you're somewhere between optimistic and pipe dream. But that's just me.
You think so, though? I don't know. How much? I don't know. Maybe some people do know how much attention is paid to OPSEC in terms of the president, and not just the president, but the president's staff, like anyone in.
Well, I mean,
people have access
paid
to the overall
OPSEC, but we're not supposed to be political here. I think handlers of all forms are having a difficult time getting through to the president in terms of certain behavior modifications. Did I say that politically correctly enough?
No, I think that's a correct statement, and if the president is able to override those cautions, which one would expect he probably is, then it's a significant concern.
Well, I mean, I don't think any of us are close enough to the issue to say whether, like, how much of a concern. Yeah, it is speculation. I mean, we know from movies and TV and maybe some documentaries that may hint towards it, but certainly movies and TV address those issues as well as to that struggle, because let's face it, not just the president, but his staff and cabinet are people too that have personal devices and personal habits that could impact the security as it surrounds the White House. And I think that probably for good reason, not many of us have insight into those processes. And
well, I mean, there's been related reports coming out, and of course you have to get into the whole fake news thing or not, but supposedly a lot of his staff are still using personal emails.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, if the OPSEC is
and
bad,
probably still using personal devices as well.
yeah, and if the OPSEC is bad, as you just pointed out, that I would deem as bad. That needs to be fixed. That's concerning to me, most certainly. So
Let's talk about.
just wanted to bring in some realism to the story from security.
I don't think
experts
it's possible to bring any measure of realism to this meta narrative.
Well, we're going to try as security. I'm using air quotes experts, air quotes for those just listening, experts. So there are a couple stories in here that really tick me off because they're just clear attempts at clickbait. The 5 top IoT security nightmares is one, and in specifically Computer World was the culprit for this. They had 2 stories: the 5 top IoT security nightmares and 7 more security TED Talks that you can't miss. Both those articles piqued my interest. Both those articles you couldn't read without signing up for an account, which I thought was like an atrocity until I said, well, I'm giving a talk. Well, I have a talk that's proposed that will address IoT security nightmares. I have more than 5. I have 19 IoT security nightmares that I'll be detailing in a talk. And I'm like, mine doesn't require wait a minute. I'm giving it at a conference that does require some form of registration.
You don't have to register. You just have to pay for admittance.
It says pay for admittance, I guess there's a registration process. Even with a B-Sides conference, you still have to register, right, for tell them you're attending kind of thing. And then I'm like, well, we'll do it as a webcast, and you have to register for that as well. So in any case.
All right, Paul, nothing is free.
Nothing is free.
But
after we do a webcast, there is a period of time that we do release the video publicly, so we do not hide that information. And if I do it at a conference where, like, Adrian is recording, that ends up on the internet too. So,
right.
I have 19 nightmares.
So you feel better now?
I feel a little better now. A little better. I don't want to like toot my own horn and say, oh, well, I have 19 and they have 5. I don't know what their 5 are. Probably 100% overlap from their 5 are included in my 19. But I think it's.
But I think you're highlighting what to me is the bigger problem, issue, cause of consternation, is that most of whatever the nightmares are. Most of the companies that are touting these nightmares are vendors that are trying to sell some sort of solution to get you beyond IoT.
It could be. It could be folks trying to provide security for IoT.
It could be, but a lot of the discussion about IoT it's become the latest, marketing sales buzzword.
Correct.
It's the latest FUD, and that's, inevitable, I guess, to some degree. I would just like to be able to take the conversation beyond the FUD to.
Okay,
well,
so what are we really
gonna do about it?
So that's where my talk is very, very specifically aimed at, Jeff.
Maybe I'll register and.
There you go. You have to register. While there's 19 nightmares, those are based on things I thought about in previous years, like 2007 when we published the book, and when I was looking at printer security in 2001, all those kinds of things. However, it's secondary to, it's setting the stage for like what some of the real solutions are that I believe as a security community we need to get behind and support in some way that offer a positive way to improve the security of IoT devices. And that's solely where my talk is focused, basically describing how the nightmares are coming true today in a very realistic fashion, and focused on currently 3, possibly more, solutions for the IoT security problem. So some of which we've talked about on the show, right? We've talked about.
I was going to say, how come we haven't talked about these solutions on the show? Oh, because you're selling something.
No, I'm not selling anything. I'm not selling it. We've talked about Cyber UL on the show. We've talked about Mudge. And his initiatives. We've talked about, with Bruce Potter, right, the FCC and filing suit. And we've talked about bug bounties for IoT devices. So there's a spoiler for my talk. then I think it's an important conversation to have with the security community.
That's something I forgot to mention on the tech segment. Is somebody asked a question about whether HP had ever considered starting a bug bounty program.
What was their response to that?
Their response was, I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but basically they've thought about it, but they're not terribly interested.
Interesting.
And I think it stems largely from the fact that so many of the latent issues with printers are kind of basic stuff. It was like I remember thinking at the time, could I get a bug bounty for revealing a default password?
Yeah, right.
That type of thing. Anyway, I digress. Back to the ways you're trying to make money with IoT.
Not me.
That's right. We're living in a post-truth alternative fact world, Paul, and you're dealing in alternative facts. So
no, I'm not.
I'm just messing with you, man.
Let's talk about end user awareness. There was an article posted that said Security Training 101, stop blaming the user. Basically, the author says ultimately user errors should be classified in two categories. One, mistakes that anyone can make, and two, mistakes that no one should make. And that your training program should be focused on number two, mistakes that no one should make. I agree with that in principle. However, as I alluded to in the interview, I think we should also be focused on our user awareness training, also incorporating very heavily what you do either when you notice a potential incident or when you're notice an incident that's already occurred, right? In the operations that happen afterwards, what's everyone's role? I think that should all be part of end user awareness training. Agree? Disagree?
I pretty much agree. It's, to throw out my shameless pitch, I'll be giving a talk at B-Side San Francisco in a couple weeks entitled...
It's only $25 per user to attend Jeff's talk.
That's right.
And you have to register, you have to give your name.
I think it's actually $30, and it will be on the web. And
you'll have to register, you have to give your name, email address, social security number, date of birth.
But fair enough. But, the talk is, does DoD level security work in the real world? And one of the things that I want to bring out is essentially what you're talking about is the user awareness. But the user awareness needs to be in context. It needs to be people need to know what they do and what they don't do, how that impacts or potentially impacts the business. And I actually just wrote a blog to sort of advertise my talk for a competitor of my former employer, which I won't mention. I talk about one of my earliest experiences was I actually got written up for a security violation at my first government job because I put my classified materials into a safe and thought I had locked it, but I hadn't spun the dial enough. And apparently... and all the lock village people out there picking, will know, you have to spin the dial a certain number of times to set all the tumblers to actually lock the safe. So, but I think back to those days where, it was a safe inside a locked office, inside a building that had security guards, and you had to have access and clearance to get into the building. And I was young and naive and thought, what's the big deal? But looking back on it, as I was writing this blog, I was thinking about all the procedures that were in place and about how the entire culture of the organization was attuned to security, so that any little step, any little point of the process, no matter what it was something that you just did and you understood that you did it. And if you saw somebody not doing it, you'd call them out for it, or you'd tell somebody. So user awareness, like you said, it's not just doing or not doing the things, but keeping your eyes open for the other people doing things or not doing things.
So wait,
weird
Jeff,
stuff going on.
You wrote a blog for a competitor of a former employer. Did it begin with a Q, an R, or a B?
A T. And ended with an E. That doesn't give much of a clue, does it?
I devil's advocate statement. Do you think that today we're placing too much burden on the end user from a security perspective?
I think we're placing too much blame, which I think was
That's the point of the
essence
article.
of this article.
Yeah.
Well, and in general, Jeff, I think I've been going to hacker conferences for the last couple of years after being on hiatus for a time, and I keep hearing variations of, the sky is falling, everything is bad, and it's somebody else's fault. Whether it's users, it's mostly users, and it's mostly developers. Those are probably the two most common culprits. But there's other variations. But basically, it's somebody else's fault. And I keep thinking, if you see the problem and you work for a company or you have a customer where you're seeing a problem and the problem is persistent, maybe at some point you should think about your part of the problem because you're not fixing it.
Yeah. I mean, and that was really the point of my question too, because. Yeah. I think there's a tendency to shift, as you were saying, shift the blame or shift the burden or both, to that end user to, sort of avoid having to take on that burden yourself as the organization. So it's a concern because we know in the community that the hacking the human is the shortest path to success.
Well, yeah, I've been having this ongoing discussion about pen testing, and I was talking to Jabra on Twitter today, and he was confirming that phishing attacks are still the number one way that pen testers gain access. And I'm like, really? So and I'm not picking on Jabra or his company or any company in particular, but to me, if the methodology of your pen test is to go out and launch a phishing attack, which I did 20 years ago, and I think this is an indictment of the whole industry. If we haven't moved our customers beyond that in 20 years, are we really providing any kind of service to our customers?
No, I think yes and no. I would argue that point a little bit.
Sure,
if that's
please argue.
If that's the only thing we're doing as penetration testers, then absolutely we're doing our customers a disservice. But if that's part of the suite, it's a legitimate part of the suite of attacks or methodology that we should be providing, because definitely the users are weak. And I'll give an example without naming any names. I mean,
Job, hold on.
Yep.
It's not that all the users are weak, or even some of the users are weak. You only need one user that's weak.
Well, that's true. And Chris brought that point up, right? Too often, not too often, I mean all the time, pretty much, pen testers or attackers, we take advantage of the fact that we just need to find one issue to get us some purchase, some leverage, whereas defenders have to defend all of it at the same time. It's unfair, frankly. I mean, it's that 2-year-old in the playground. Like, why is it so unfair? So I have a lot of respect for blue teamers who are doing a good job. I have a tremendous amount of respect for blue teamers that are doing a good job in covering the territory.
Also, it looks like Monoprice or something threw up on the floor behind you.
I was going to say, I have an issue with that pile of wires right behind.
That is not effective wire management, my friend. No, you should know better.
I was waiting till one of you guys actually said something. But we had a power outage this week, and I was running.
I thought you were going to say we had a LAN party this weekend.
Yeah. Yeah. We had a bunch of fun in the house.
I had all my friends over, and we played Quake.
So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it, and I'm totally now distracted from whatever point I was trying.
You see, pen testing is too easy.
No, that's it. I mean, we just have to find one weakness, right? And normally we find that one weakness in the human, And there's a tendency to blame the human and the training of the organization. But I'll give an example. I was working with an organization this past week, and we attacked them with social engineering, just like most pen testers would when we're doing a pen test, in this case, a red teaming context. And, they were very, very good. They defended, in terms of the infrastructure and the security ops, they defended everything that we brought forward to them. Now, the users, unfortunately, a subset of them did, click on things and do things that they shouldn't have. But it was only a subset. It was less than 10%. So, my point of saying that is there are organizations that are doing a really good job, not only at the security ops layer of defending appropriately, but also at the training layer of making sure that the awareness is there. So it does work, although still to this day we know that attacking the human is the easiest path as attackers. And I think
to add on to that, Joff, one of the things that John and I did a while ago, and I'm sure you guys still do this today, was with certain clients, obviously it has to be the appropriate client. We say, look, we're going to be able to trick one user. Like, eventually, we're going to be able to trick one user. And let's say you've done an awesome job, and you've educated all of your current users, right? Users come and go, employees come and go. It's just the nature of business. And there always is going to be, or there will be a point in time where a user is going to be able to be tricked into clicking a link. All right? Let's put that aside and say, what?
It's just it's a matter of time, right?
Let's just give us a foothold in a workstation, and let's see what we can do from there, right? I mean, realize that if the client understands the end-user awareness problem, the phishing problem, and they're taking measures to prevent that as much as possible, okay, we don't need to test that. Let's skip that step. Let's get on a workstation. Let's see where we can go from there, and make sure that there may be points in time where 100% of your users aren't going to be duped, but fast forward a couple of weeks or a month, okay, now you get a few users that are duped. Okay, once they are, then what do you do? Then how difficult is it for an attacker to move forward from that point before they get caught? I'm not saying you're making it impossible for a user to pivot or do bad things. I'm saying you're making it hard enough and obvious enough that you're going to notice that attack in a very reasonable time frame, right? You're taking the time to detection from hours, maybe 24 hours, 48 hours, and not letting that go 6 months or a year, as we've seen in some breaches. I think that's a very valid usage, Jeff, to kind of your point of penetration testing. I don't know how you feel about that, but
so just to chime in before Jeff responds. I mean, that's exactly the point that John and I and yourself we've talked about, and we actually move people towards more of a scientific testing method where we say, just put us on the inside, right? Because sooner or later we're going to get there anyway. So put us on the inside and let's test your process, procedure, and technology from the perspective of actually having a position inside your network. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a very effective way to do it because the time and effort involved in actually doing that social engineering exercise. Is money that people want to save, right? I mean, they know it's ultimately going to succeed. That's exactly right. So over to Jeff, I guess, to respond to that.
Right. So, my context is always 20 years ago, but we used to, sell pen tests to our customers, which were really vulnerability assessments, which was what they really needed at the time. Mm-hmm. What are our problems? But, one of the discussions in terms of sort of scoping the engagement was always, well, do you want us to just spend your money by discovering things? Or like you said, assume that we're going to get in and put us somewhere where we can move around. We didn't call it pivoting back then. I don't know when that term was invented, but, put us someplace strategic where we can pivot around, assuming that we've, done our due diligence. We've done something that ultimately is going to be successful that gets us on your network. But I think, Paul, you're bringing to light what I think is the essential element of what pen testing, in my opinion, should be in 2017, which I'm afraid too often is not, is that it's really a test of your defenses. It should be threat based. Joff alluded to that earlier. You should be really be testing your ability to detect, not necessarily withstand attack, but detect attacks. So it's a live fire test. It's how do our defenses work? Have all of our efforts at monitoring and detecting, how well do they work? I mean, we used to do that 20 years ago. We would advertise, well, we'll come in stealthy, and we'll wait to see if you detect us or not. And we'd start off. The analogy I always used to use was we would slowly turn up the volume.
Right.
And we were basing it on Tom Tachek's paper on evading intrusion. Tachek's evasive techniques. But invariably every time we would get to the point where we had cranked the volume up to 11 because they weren't detecting us, and we were just going around being as noisy as we could be in a networking sense, banging pots and stuff, and they still weren't seeing us.
Right.
So hopefully we've evolved from that perspective, and there, obviously there's more technologies available today for detection, but recent history, there's certain major breaches where they had all the detection in place and monitoring in place, and still, the breach went undetected for however long it was, a year and a half.
And I think it's interesting along this subject on how penetration testers are often limited in doing some damaging attacks, and attackers are not. I mean, the Saudi Aramco. Did I say that right? Saudi Aramco attack was evidence of that. They just basically blew up 35,000 computers, right? I've seen attacks. I haven't tested them, but there are attacks where an iOS user, Apple iOS user, can receive a text message, and it basically freezes their phone, right? And that's the limitation there that I saw. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but there are some attacks that can basically, it just locks up the phone. There are attacks on a Samsung Galaxy device that via an SMS message, and the attack against iOS was an SMS message, but this SMS message for Samsung Galaxies can basically wipe the device and destroy all the data. And it's kind of interesting, as penetration testers, we know those attacks exist, but we can't go into the organization and be like, oh, hey, you know what? I just wiped all your users, whether they were personal or corporate phones. Like, I just wiped all of them. Like, how are you going to respond to that? And it's kind of interesting how we test for those scenarios, because these scenarios do exist. Now, there are fixes for this. The disclosure and was very responsible. The response from Samsung, I thought, was very responsible. The timeline went something like vulnerabilities were reported to Samsung in June, fixed in August, and patched on November 7th, and then the disclosure was made. So very responsible disclosure there. You couldn't do it much better than that. One could argue that point, but I think that was done very well. Not only was this particular attack, but there were other CVEs that were issued for a team that found lots of other vulnerabilities, including remote code execution, I believe, as well. So while concerning, it's kind of interesting how an organization would respond to these attacks in the real world if penetration testers aren't able to do that. And you kind of dip into, I wish Doug White was here, into kind of a cyber exercise, for lack of a better term, like how you deal with that, and going through those exercises at high value targets like Saudi Aramco. Like, let's say everyone's phones there shut off at a certain time, and maybe everyone comes in on a weekend or whatever.
We're missing something though, Paul. I got to interject. One of the things that we deal with on a frequent basis, I feel it's important to add this component, is basically the security maturity of any organization we're dealing with. I mean, if we have a brand new customer and we say, and we would propose a full red team or a very comprehensive penetration test, we would be irresponsible because we haven't really assessed that customer for the level of maturity that they're at in their security operation, right? But
No, I agree. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, but if we come back to a customer we've been working with a year or 2 years, and we know that they're defending well, they've tuned up their organization, it's working well, then we can propose a true threat model. So, I mean, you've got to be careful in how you couch it, because there are definitely differences in the maturity level of security operations and incident response staffs that it would make one pen test a complete walkover for one customer, and another pen test a very difficult.
As much as I want to disagree with Joff for entertainment purposes, I have to agree. Right? If you were going to do a cyber exercise type of event, it would be with a customer, Joff, as you said, that you've done the basics, you've done some testing with, you've established a relationship with. Then you went to them and said, look, what if there was a, air quotes, cyber attack, and, by the way, as part of that attack, a distraction was, we wiped every phone in your organization. So you know what? Let's do an exercise where your team goes in, everyone checks their cell phones at the door. They're out of scope. It's done. They're not a method for communication, and there's some kind of attack on your network. How do you respond to that? I think it's very much like what Ed Scotus in Counteract Challenges is working on, and a lot of the cyber exercises are doing. I think that my point is it's a valid exercise to go through. As Chris said in her interview, she walked into a situation where all 35,000 computers were offline, right? And I think practicing for those types of scenarios and having contingency plans is certainly something you do, and to your point, Joff, somewhere on the maturity curve, right? It's not your first test, certainly. It's something you do on the maturity curve to basically simulate what an attacker would do and be able to take some of the gloves off of penetration testers. Jeff, well, I see you comment on that. So
yeah, I'm chomping at the bit here. So, I mean, what you're describing, Paul, is really making the penetration tests more a part of incident response and incident response planning or business continuity and recovery, whatever you want to call it, not, which is what pen testing historically has been, part of the vulnerability management function of your enterprise, which is kind of where I'm going. After 25 years of pen testing, where it might have been valid for vulnerability discovery and just sorting, doing that initial assessment of your customer back in the day, shouldn't we have evolved beyond that now? And are there regulatory compliance things in place that kind of handicap it, and companies are hiring pen testers just because they have to, and they don't really have any specific goals? They don't know what they want to get out of it. They don't even know what it is.
Right.
Yeah, I think all that still exists. I had a question for Joff, though. I mean, this was our experience many years ago, and I'm wondering if you still experience it today. I assume when you engage a client, and let's say it's a new customer, you have some sort of planning, organizational, introductory meeting where you get some sort of lay of the land, some sort of description of what you're up against, some sort of discussion of what their topology is, what the goals of the pen test should be, what you should focus on. Probably a lot of variations, but you have some sort of introductory meeting with the customer. I know most of the time when we would have those introductory meetings, we pretty much knew what was going to be successful in terms of breaking in before we ever attempted it, just based on conversation. Do you still find that true today? Is that your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say absolutely that is our experience. You can tell in the language, in the way people talk about their environment, about what they're doing as you get familiar in those conversations. And I think usually, I'm going to sound egotistical when I say this, but usually within that first 15 minutes or so, and maybe that's even being generous, I can tell how successful the engagement's going to be. So I think that's a true statement.
No, I don't think that's egotistical. I think that's, more about the technology than your customer does, right?
There's a lot to that, but you can tell by it's almost like even though a lot of these are over the phone, right, or over some sort of meeting technology, there's a lot in the verbal language, and if you were face to face, you would tell it in body language of the way people present themselves and understand what they're dealing with, and it's the you can tell when somebody's really, another way of saying it, when somebody's really humble and they present themselves as really humble, you typically know that's going to be a much more difficult engagement.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we always knew when customers say, yeah, we're good. We just took a training course. We just installed fill in the blank. So,
Right.
Or we don't store that. We don't capture that data. And, we knew, we were going to find it. But the customers we had that were like, well, we think we've done the right things. We've tried to do our due diligence. We just don't know what we've missed, and we want you to check it. Yeah, they're the ones that were usually pretty well off.
I want to delve back into politics just for a second. Sort of.
Oh, do you have
Not
to?
really, but
I'm out of alcohol, so tread lightly.
There is a bill that's calling for a study of cybersecurity standards for cars. It's got bipartisan support, apparently, and is calling for the, what is it called? NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, I want to say. Maybe. Did I get that right? I think I did. Yeah, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to oversee the security of cars. Is this a good thing? It could be. It could be. It's kind of interesting how we're calling for a government body, some are calling for a government body to oversee IoT devices. When it comes to cars, the safety concerns are so high. I know this speaks to like a risk model of some kind, right? The stakes are higher when it comes to vehicles, that the idea of a government body regulating this type of thing is much more of a reality. But when it comes to things like IoT devices, not so much of a reality because of the perceived potential impacts today. I think they will increase over time. However, the threat today is, well, cars are computers, they're connected. This could mean bad things for safety. There is a historical record of safety and not so safe things happening in cars. And I think a higher probability of injuries and deaths as it pertains to vehicles, cars, as opposed to IoT devices like thermostats and home automation, whatever, that the government's kind of stepping in, and it has better support in the political climate than do other efforts for IoT devices.
So one thing that occurs to me, Paul, as you were saying that, and I'll defer to you in just a second, Jeff, it was where software meets kinetic effects.
Yeah.
Is where it gets to the point where the government feels like they need to regulate, and there's significant perceived danger. That seems to be the connection to me. ICS SCADA vehicles. That's where software meets kinetic effect.
Well, no, specifically with vehicles, Jeff. I think the concern is in the previous data that we have in terms of injury and death. Right? Like, we all know, we've all gone on airplanes a lot, and we know the risk with airplanes. We know we're much more likely to get in an accident in a car on the way to the airport than we are then to die or become injured in a plane crash. Likely die in a plane crash, just not to be morbid, but that's the truth, right? So the standards in governing bodies are going to pay more attention to that because it's a higher risk. Much like organizations are going to pay attention to certain things rather than others because there's a higher risk associated with it. And
it's not a higher risk; it's a more devastating risk.
Well, the effects are more devastating. If something bad happens, the effects are more devastating, Joe.
Yeah, it's a life safety concern.
The consequences are a little bit more absolute.
Correct.
But
go ahead, Jeff.
So I wanted to comment on your original supposition. My first thought was I find it fascinating that our community, which so often has less than positive things to say about government and government regulation and government innovation continues to point to the government as the only way of solving the IoT problem. Not that it's right or wrong. I just think it's the only fascinating.
Way, it is a way. It's not the only way. I think.
Well, it seems to be becoming more the common denominator.
To share my somewhat personal views, because as I've
are we going to have to register to hear them?
No.
Okay, go for it.
So. But like I have a cigar podcast, right? So I'm close to that industry as well. I've been in computer security for a while now, obviously. But I think that what I've learned in terms of studying a lot of these government regulations in recent history, in the past couple of years anyway, is that and interviewing what's his name? It'll come to me. The science fiction author guy. Good Lord, I'm getting old. I can't.
That's what happens, man.
This is sleep deprivation having a newborn.
It is total sleep deprivation.
That's not Neil deGrasse Tyson you're talking about.
No, that's not Neil.
No,
he hasn't been on the show.
Because we talked about this with Corey, right?
Steve Nye, the science guy. That's what it is.
No, we talked about this with
Bill Nye.
That's Bill Nye.
Wrong guy. Jeez.
That's Bill Nye. Corey Doctorow. We talked about this Corey Doctorow,
Corey,
right?
there you go. Corey.
The regulation, and what I've come to understand today in my stance, and you can argue this with me, that's fine, is that not all government regulation is good and not all of it is bad, right? And there's varying degrees of it in between good and bad. However, I think in certain circumstances we reach for government regulation, and some people think that's a stretch and it could have negative consequences. In other circumstances, such as with cars, the consequences, as Jeff pointed out, are so high that we need some kind of government regulation. And that's just one example. There are so many other examples where, as we see with the current administration and previous administration, in the contrast between the two, some regulations are good, some are bad, and it depends on your perspective as well as another aspect of government regulation.
Right. So, and I'm not disparaging government regulation necessarily. I just think it's interesting that we as a community tend to dismiss it. Where, like you said, it's almost like, well, when the stakes are really high, when things are really, really, the consequences are really dire, the risk is high. What else is there? The only thing serious and real, is, with all the warts it has, is government regulation.
Right.
That's
so
a perception.
You were talking I don't know if that's really true, Jeff, but that's certainly the perception.
Yeah,
right?
Well,
is it true?
Yeah,
I don't know. Could be.
We could debate that. I don't know of any other, within or without of the security community, technology community. Usually, it boils down to government intervention. Why do we have seatbelts in cars?
Right.
We're talking about cars. Why do we have airbags in cars? Why do we have traffic controls, traffic lights? It ultimately comes down to it's a life or death thing.
Right. Rules and regulations. Yeah.
But it comes down to the government has to provide the regulations, enforce it. So the question I wanted to ask, and it's a rhetorical question, is given what you know about technology and the security of things, how comfortable would you be, and would you ever sit in a car that's self-driven and let yourself be driven around by a self-controlled,
I think today, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, that scares the poo out of me.
Yep.
I'm sure it's, like everything else, like, we should never go to the cloud. We should never do Wi-Fi. There's going to be a break-in period where nobody's going to do it that's serious about security, but someday it's going to become the norm, which freaks me out.
I'm on the fence on that particular question. I know it's rhetorical, but I want to answer it, right?
Go for it.
And it comes down to this. Humans as operators of vehicles have been proven to be incredibly fallible. So if the algorithms are demonstrated as statistically better and the security is demonstrated as appropriate, then why not?
I think if every car on the road was an autonomous vehicle, your safety could be higher because you're taking out the human factor. But now, transpose that into an airplane. Like, would you get in an airplane that didn't have a pilot? I don't know. And how much of it depends on the ability?
It's a mixed argument because airplanes are largely automated.
Autonomous, correct.
Autonomous. The pilots aren't doing a whole lot, but it's sort of.
But there is someone there.
Issue.
There is someone there in case
there's somebody there. It's a
moment.
perception issue. Yeah. It's like it's safer to fly an airplane than it is to drive in a car. But there's a lot of people that will refuse to get on an airplane that will drive around a car all the time.
But and in airplaning, there's also people on the ground monitoring as well, air traffic controllers, right? We don't necessarily have the same model for cars.
That's true. That's true. And I think this is somewhat, also to add to that, somewhat a quintessential American problem because we do have a very large operative road network and are not as heavily influenced by public transportation such as rail. So it's going to, we are going to be the proving ground without a doubt in this particular question.
All right, let's talk about some other stories. My default credentials found in Schneider Electric Wonderware Historian. I actually worked on a project several years ago to do configuration management for Wonderware. I'm joking when I say it's all my fault. Obviously, that was years ago, different software versions or whatever. But it's kind of interesting that software that I worked on has default passwords in the database, as the case may be. In this software is used to manage SCADA.
Did you look it up? Is it the same default password as several years ago?
I don't know if I don't remember my code from that long ago, depending, and how it looked for default passwords.
I think it might be your fault, Jeff. What do you think?
Could be my fault. It could, you know what? It's probably I apologize. Public apology. I'm sorry. So,
moving on to the next story.
Next story. Moving on.
Next story.
The researchers propose a way to use your heartbeat as a password. My question is, so apparently there are medical devices that you can wear that monitor your heartbeat and send it back to like a monitoring facility. I didn't know that this technology existed, but there are heartbeat monitoring solutions, and researchers have proposed that we use this as some method of authentication. And
so we're going on and on about how we don't trust IoT and all the things that could go wrong with IoT, and we're going to turn around and use it as a security measure, an authentication device?
Apparently, that's good. It's a good point, Jeff, that there are a lot of variables in there that could be exploited potentially to bypass authentication. But my question was, how unique is your heartbeat, and how repeatable is your heartbeat to spoof and whatnot? I don't know.
I think your heartbeat probably does have a unique signature.
I think everyone has a unique heartbeat. I've never thought about it.
It may not be everyone has a unique heartbeat, but it's unique enough tied to a user ID.
Okay.
My concern is actually different than that, and my concern is the same as the concern I have with all biometric measures, and that is, as soon as somebody stores that information, probably a hash of that information,
right,
you can't ever change it.
Right.
So, I mean,
well, that's the problem with phones,
unique,
right? It's your fingerprint is just a hash that's stored on the device, and yeah.
And that's where I really have a problem with biometric-based authentication.
There was a really bad article about net neutrality, which is a really horrific issue that we were talking about before the show. Basically, net neutrality is on the chopping block, which is concerning, especially for us as a podcast. Many podcasters have been addressing this issue, especially recently. Essentially, it boils down to the example of, Comcast owns NBC as well. I think that was the example, right? Comcast is an internet provider and a content provider in the NBC network. If net neutrality goes away, NBC gets the high-speed lane. All other content gets the low-speed lane, which causes some kind of conflict of interest. There's lots of examples of this out there where internet providers are essentially the same people that are providing content, and now without net neutrality would be able to basically enact a conflict of interest and promote their own content and demote everyone else's content. Very concerning issue, somewhat outside of the realm of security. Well, I think we did touch on this with Core Doctorow as well. But this article tries to then say, well, it means the demise of IoT. I don't see it impacting IoT in this case. I think IoT is a very low bandwidth kind of thing. I don't think that providers would necessarily be able to use this to promote an IoT device over another. And I think it's taking it away from the issue at hand, right? The issue is the larger issue of content, not so much IoT devices. Again, going back to your point, Jeff, that IoT is just a buzzword that everyone wants to jump on.
Yeah, that was my first thought, but then I there might be some substance to the argument that IoT takes a backseat to bandwidth when it becomes something that's a little bit more critical, like medical devices, that need to have reliable uptime, that type of thing.
I think it's more going to impact your ability to watch Netflix on your Verizon, Comcast, AT&T, whatever network.
Yeah, I don't think people are worrying about Netflix. I think they're worrying about other things that they're able to watch, but whatever.
Yeah, I think it's really
adult material. I think is what Jeff is referring to. Yes.
Look. I think it's a really interesting discussion because from the operator perspective, it's long been known that things that are latency sensitive, such as voice video, require priority in order to deliver a reliable service, right? So there are reasons that prioritization of traffic exists as a technology, and it's in order to provide a quality result. But that gets distorted when you get into issues of pay to play, which is really what we're talking about. And the traditional response of a lot of providers to date, given the current regulatory environment, which is clearly under threat, has been oversubscribed, right? They've always just said, we'll build bigger pipes and the problem goes away. That is a challenge that you can't beat eventually, right? You can only have such pipes before you're in a congested situation. And so there's a reasonable argument to say that quality of service measures in network implementations can deliver reliable service, but as long as it's a flat playing ground, as long as it's an equal playing ground, and that's where it gets murky, right? So it's a multifaceted issue, I guess, is what I'm trying to point out. It's not just as simple as put the bits on the wire and let them play.
Right.
People in networks for a long time have been providing differentiated service. The real question is on the pay to play and having large wallet commercial entities dominate and use the technology for, I guess, competitive advantage more so than quality of service reasons.
Right. Yeah, you wonder how Google's going to respond to that, right? I mean, Google being equally as big a company as the major internet providers. However, Google largely, I mean, they've had their dabbles in it, is not an internet provider. However, YouTube's a huge portion of that. And so Google's put it at a disadvantage, although Google being Google and being a major company, it's interesting how they'll respond to all that.
Well, ultimately, I think it's an economic decision. The bandwidth issues are, it's ongoing. Bandwidth is expanded and then it gets filled up. But I think the issue is fundamentally who pays more or how much revenue opportunity is there for the bigger paying customers versus the little guys. So
yeah, does Google pay off the providers to get YouTube higher priority on those networks so their service continues as it is? Well,
there's a good old fashioned BGP things that are already at work. I guarantee you there are providers that I already know for a fact there are providers directly peering with Google to get shorter router hops, to get preferential service, if you like, in terms of the traffic, right?
Yep.
To offload their transit points. So, it gets even more complex when you start talking about what I would consider the sort of the mega providers, the very large service providers of content that have, preferential peering relationships already to short circuit and probably economically advantage the situation of not having to go across other transit points in the network. So it's a very multifaceted issue. This is not although people like to boil it down to be a very simplistic issue, it's just not that, right? I mean, you look at the network of a whole, you've got quality of service technologies involved, you've also got BGP technologies involved, you've got people making peering relationships that are economically advantageous to them as providers. And it's going to be something that is not easily solved. I mean, that's just a fact.
I want to quickly cover Facebook embraces U2F to improve user security, login security, rather. This is essentially the YubiKey and the... I actually just ordered a couple of these devices because I want to test them out and start using them. There's an open standard for two-factor authentication. There's a bunch of different devices out there, YubiKey being one of the examples. It came under criticism from researchers several months ago or early last year, something like that. There are open source alternatives to implementing this two-factor authentication as well, but Facebook has now adopted it, and it joins the likes of Google, Dropbox, Salesforce, GitHub, and others that will use this two-factor authentication. It's certainly something that I want to play around with in having an actual hardware, although I get concerned when it reaches the masses, when you lose your two-factor authentication token, how much that sucks. You almost need two. One is a backup and one is your primary one. And the ability and the willingness of people to be able to do that, I think, is coming under question. I think it certainly protects against account hijacking.
Well, I've always said in the pen testing community, multi-factor, better, right? I mean, if we can do it, and we can do it cheaply and effectively, then good. And securely, obviously, but...
It's better. I mean, but like we were saying earlier, everything can be broken. It's a matter of how much you want to commit to it and how much you want to focus on it. There are ways to subvert a multi-factor authentication system. Is it worth it to the attacker? Maybe not. Generally speaking, is it better than just a password? Yeah. For most instances, I think that would be true.
The last, sorry, Joe, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we're running short on time. The last two stories that I had were not so much security related as they are kind of geeky, nerdy related. Asus has made a beefed up Raspberry Pi that is beefed up, but also twice the cost of a Raspberry Pi, which is kind of interesting, worth looking at. If you're listening to this show, likely is a Pentest Dropbox. I know Bo Bullock is very big into that as well. Also, how to save an old laptop by installing this free OS. Clickbait, can you say clickbait? But it doesn't make you register, just as an example. But Pixel can be installed on old laptops and revive your old laptop, which I think is great. So just two kind of geeky, nerdy things in my stories 12 and 13. In the wiki.securityweekly.com, references all the stories that we talked about in this show and all the other shows on our network. Jeff and Joff, thank you very much for joining and participating in this edition of Paul's Security Weekly.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks to our special guest, Chris Kubecka, for joining us this evening. Thanks to everyone for listening and watching. We'll see everyone on the next episode of Paul's Security Weekly. Over and out.